Hello, hello. Welcome back to the Drupal 7 End of Life podcast. I'm Mark Dorison, and as usual, we have Chris Free.
Hey, good afternoon, good morning, good evening.
We had a great interview last week with Arena Zax. We've gotten some amazing feedback on it. So if you missed that episode, go back and check it out wherever you're getting this podcast. It was just a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I know, Chris, you said you learned a ton.
Yeah, I thought the D7 or D9 soft landing, all the bits about that, I'd heard about it, but I'd just her perspective was really interesting, and really looking forward to today's conversation.
Yeah, so that was the D7 soft landing initiative. Check that out in episode 4. But today, we have Tim Lehnen joining us. Tim is the CTO of the Drupal Association. Tim has been with the Drupal Association since 2014. Served in a number of different roles, and that's 9 years now. So there's a ton to talk about. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate being here with you, Mark and Chris. And thanks to Chromatic as well, as a Drupal certified partner of the association. I really appreciate that. For those out there who don't know, the Drupal Association is a nonprofit organization, and so it takes the support of partners like Chromatic and individual members out there in the community to make the association possible and do all that we do to support the Drupal project.
Thanks for that, Tim. I always forget that the money that we donate, the time that we donate has a real impact. So it's always nice to hear somebody say, good job. Yeah, it's like when our employees say, hey, you guys are running a great company. It's like, oh, you know what?
Yeah, you gotta own it. I mean, one of those things, we were talking about this before we started, the Drupal community is fond of constructive criticism, let's say. And it's worthwhile to take a minute here and there and celebrate the things we do well. So.
Yeah, there's no lack of back and forth in the Drupal community. Let's just say that. Most of it well-intended, and but there are many Drupal issues that are 8, 9, 10 years old. I think my favorite
is hundreds of comments long, and
hundreds and hundreds of comments long. Like there was an issue, I think, opened by Eric Duran to change the throbber, the loading animation, and it's like that took a long time to get pushed.
We all have an opinion on what color that bike shed should be.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think too, if you are, if you're a maintainer of a contrib module, or you're involved in Drupal core, or you run a company, or you're involved in an organ, you always hear all the problem areas. Everyone's always coming to you with what could be better and what could, what's not working the way they hoped it would. And even when it's well-intentioned, sometimes you're just like, is anything going right? So
we need those moments. I mean, especially.
So go tell your favorite contrib module maintainer, thank you for the work that they're doing, is the moral of the story.
Absolutely.
Tim, to start out, you alluded to this a little bit, but for people that don't know, and I think even as someone who's been involved in the Drupal community for a long time now, can you explain for folks where the responsibilities of the Drupal Association sort of like where they begin and end, and how that abuts up to the community as a whole?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's in some ways it's a simple answer, and in some ways it's a little complex, like a lot of things in Drupal. So the Drupal Association, the Drupal project itself is now 22 years old. The project's been around a long time, and the association is not quite that old, but like all open source projects, it evolved organically, and as the project sort of blew up and gained size, and as people started attending Drupal events in greater numbers, a small sort of volunteer board that Dries, the project founder, put together, was like, hey, we've got like money coming in the door from doing conferences. We've got, volunteers. We have Drupal.org that's currently just being maintained by whoever can do it. And maybe we should put together a formal organization. And so from there, they formed the Drupal Association with a specific mission to support the Drupal community in doing the work, to, not to like replace core development, not to take over the trajectory of the project. It's still an open source project, but to handle all of the plumbing and all of the infrastructure and all of the tooling that's needed to allow the community to come together and collaborate and build Drupal. And then from there, the mission has evolved a little further. So we're also now looking into ways to help promote Drupal, to help provide comparative materials to show Drupal against other kind of CMS and DXP solutions. We are looking at how Drupal is positioned in things like common RFP scenarios. So like if a government organization is doing an RFP, we want them, A, to put open source and the open web in the forefront of their process, and B, to understand that if Drupal is going to be part of their bidding process, which it probably will be since most of the governments in the world run at least partly on Drupal, how to interact with our community to find the best work, how to find partners who give back to Drupal, who give back to the community. Because not only is that good for the life cycle of Drupal, but it's also, those are the people who do the best work. It's the people who give back and know how the project really works. So it's all of these elements. And so in the end, the DA's job is to support the community, provide some gentle guidance for the community, and to provide structure where there just needs to be some structure. Like ultimately, there's some decisions we have to make when it comes to how do we have a code of conduct as a community? What values do we hold as a community? Who is going to take legal responsibility for DrupalCon and all these events and all this kind of stuff? And that's a large part of what we do.
So when it comes to how that intersects with a version of Drupal like Drupal 7, it sounds to me, you tell me where I'm wrong or stepping out of bounds, but the Drupal Association is not responsible directly for the commits, the code that's going into Drupal, 8, 9, or 10, or Drupal 7. It's not responsible for security releases, the code that's going into them. But there is a bunch of tooling and infrastructure, is my understanding, that, there's a yada, yada, yada there to like, okay, yeah. Someone identifies a bug, it's being reported on Drupal.org. The DA is responsible for Drupal.org. And then a whole bunch of things have to happen or do happen. And then it ends up in an actual release. Can you sort of expand on the pieces that I yada yada there?
Yeah, exactly. So if we're talking about a release of Drupal, let's say, well, we're just talking about the process of putting out a new version just generically, right? So that whole contribution process in terms of putting together the ideas and the plan happens in the Drupal.org issue queue, which is maintained by the Drupal Association. And we moderate and we work with volunteers to be volunteer moderators and kind of decide how that goes. So, and ultimately, we're responsible for people using that in a respectful way and all that kind of a thing. But the work takes place there on infrastructure we've created. We then potentially provide other resources and tools to those contributors. Whether it's, if there's a specific initiative for a feature, we might provide a community Zoom account so they can organize in-person meetings. We might set up a contribution table at DrupalCon for that group, those sorts of things. So they're all working and doing their work together, and we've provided this sort of support structure. Then maybe they're ready to say, hey, we want someone in core to look at this. And the core maintainers are a group of combination of volunteer and sponsored contributors from many organizations, and some of them just doing it totally solo. And the DA can kind of convene those people and say, hey, here's this initiative, we at the DA or the Drupal Association board or whoever really wants to support them. Can we connect using our relationships with those core maintainers to say, hey, we think it's time to take a look at this or support these folks? And then, it gets committed, it goes in, and the Drupal.org infrastructure runs all the testing. So we run these big suites of CI tests against all these new features going into core. They run on huge multi-core machines with gigabytes upon gigabytes of memory that we spin up as spot instances. A full core suite test takes like an hour and 20 minutes on these huge beefy machines. So we spin those up, post all those results back, and then eventually it gets committed and prepared for a release. And similarly, a release is not as simple as, hey, we've committed something and you download a tarball from the repository or you just clone the straight code. There's a packaging pipeline process, which is all, again, on Drupal.org infrastructure. And it does things like package the license file within the tar, but it also splits out subtree components, publishes those to GitHub, makes them available to Composer, updates the Composer facade that we maintain that translates all of Drupal versions into understandable Composer versions. There's all these mechanical pieces that actually result in delivering that release. It's also Drupal.org that tells you, hey, there are updates available for your site. Come here and download them, right? Like all of that comes from Drupal.org. So in some ways, the Drupal Association can be kind of considered, like there's almost no software that doesn't have kind of a cloud component or at least an online component. And the Drupal Association maintains those components for the Drupal project as this independent sort of nonprofit body. And then beyond that, we get into decisions like security and security releases and things like end of life. And so, we mentioned that, talking about kind of governance of how all of that works, Drupal Association very rarely and in most cases is not empowered to make sort of dictatorial decisions. We don't just say, hey, this is how it goes and that's the thing. But because, Dries as the project lead is on the board, because we have these long established relationships with different core maintainers and contributors, and because we have the resources to put in sort of support structure for working groups or at DrupalCon, we are often the people like convening the room of folks who make that decision. So, when we're talking about setting a Drupal 7 end of life date, for example, it's usually the Drupal Association bringing together the security working group or members of the security team and Dries and maybe core maintainers, just the relevant stakeholders, so that they're all in the room. And that final decision is ultimately up to Dries as the project lead, but it's a collaboration between those groups, and it's the Drupal Association that brings those groups together.
From the Drupal Association's perspective, why is it important to end of life a version of Drupal in this case? Like, why is that important to do?
There's multiple reasons why software ultimately has to reach an end of life. There's some of them are very practical. From a technical point of view, there's components of a version that may not be getting attention anymore, that may have unknown vulnerabilities that nobody's ever going to find, that may just be otherwise obsolete. There are things, and sometimes those are third-party components, or it's like, what versions of jQuery are we using, or are we compatible with, which versions of PHP or MySQL are we compatible with, and are those supported? And there's a lot of people for Drupal 7 in particular who are doing good work to try and string those components as far as they can get to give people a runway. But there's only so far you can go. And eventually there's a point where you have to say, okay, we're band-aiding but not innovating anymore on a version. And that's, again, fine to provide a runway, but if we want to keep moving forward as a project, we want to take that energy that's spent on that sort of band-aiding and support process and invest it instead in the new version where innovative new things are happening. So, that's just some of the reasons, but it's one of the major factors is it's software. Software evolves. Software evolves or it dies. It's gotta continue, and it's part of maintaining your software stack to begin getting up to date and onto new versions. Not that there aren't unique challenges in the 7 space, but it is over
I speculated on a previous episode sort of that a lot of the people that are working on core have turned their attention, their interests have brought them towards what I was calling a modern version of Drupal, Drupal with Composer, Drupal 8, 9, 10. And that is where their attention has brought them. That's why Drupal has evolved and been built in the way that it has, since Drupal 8's release. It seems only natural that attention has gone away from Drupal 7 because those people who are, the majority of those people that are working on core have moved to focus the majority of their attention there. Is it?
And that's a really good point too, just in open source in general, just to expand on that for a second, which is that open source thrives on inspiring its contributors, right? And if you're in, so seven is a great piece of software, but it's a mature piece of software. And most of what, you don't think of Drupal 7 when you think, I'm going to do the next big thing. I'm going to write the, I don't know, chat GPT content. We won't get into the AI debate, or I'm gonna come up with the augmented reality interface for browsing the web, right? You don't think of the decade-old mature software as a place you want to innovate. And similarly, even if the place you want to innovate is things that are more basic, even if you're just there saying, hey, I want to make this new distribution of Drupal or this new recipe, and as they're calling it in the new initiative, that's like, this is the university use case that would just help everyone out. You're not going to do that on a legacy version. You're not going to be excited about doing that on a legacy version. And so part of the reason why we can't forever hold to these older versions is we need to reserve some of the oxygen in the room for the things that people find inspirational.
And from the DA's perspective, I was guessing that it's sort of a limitation of resources. There's only so many resources, and as time goes on and more of those new projects are being built on, let's just go with Drupal 10 since it's the latest current version of Drupal being built on Drupal 10. There seems to be understandably an obligation to keep Drupal 7 test suites running, to keep releases, because we've committed to do that. The community is committed to do that through the end of life. But at a certain point, am I correct in saying, that's why end of life has been declared, whenever that date ends up being, so that those resources can then be redeployed back in to the current.
And it doesn't sound like a lot of money, perhaps, but we still spend a couple $1,000s on testing of Drupal 7 and Drupal 7 patches every month, and alongside the testing that goes into the modern versions. We spend staff time and, more importantly, volunteer time, right? It's a dangerous thing when the sort of person hours you have from volunteers wind up being wholly absorbed in the admin overhead and in the just the support structure, right? That's part of why we exist with the small full-time staff that we have, is that so that we can take care of those sort of details and let people generate new ideas and new and innovative work and do the things that are going to be interesting to them. We don't want to burn folks out just, maintaining testing of old versions and various kinds of things. And, there are lots and lots of people. There's still almost 500,000 people who are happily using Drupal 7 and who are probably still writing new features for their specific sites. So I'm not denigrating that at all. That's all really important. But the future of Drupal is going to be continuing in these new versions. And some of the frictions and frustrations are things that I think actually to be flipped around a little bit and become opportunity for new innovations, right? Mm-hmm. You described the current versions of Drupal as either modern Drupal or Drupal with Composer. And as I talk to a lot of people, it's that with Composer part that is still a little bit of the boogeyman in whether they're upgrading. But, the existence of that friction has led people to say, hey, we need to work on automatic updates. We need to work on a project browser. We need to re-empower the site builder persona in the modern versions of Drupal. And that's leading to some new kinds of innovation. And it's also leading to collaboration with other open source projects. On the security side of both of those initiatives, the DA has worked with Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Joomla, Typo3. We've reached out to WordPress. We've worked with the Open Source Security Foundation, a lot of folks, to talk about how things that we're building, because we want them in Drupal to secure sort of automatic updates with Composer, abstracting that way into a user interface, are also secure patterns for updating kind of anything in the PHP ecosystem. So there's good things that come out of this stuff, even in the challenging parts.
And that's an ongoing initiative that's your team is working on now, right? What is the name of that initiative?
There's several related initiatives, but the Automatic Updates Initiative is the sort of main one here, where the Drupal Association in particular, right, as I mentioned earlier, it's Drupal.org that serves you your updates data when your site has an update. So the Drupal Association engineering team is working on the server side of securing those updates, and also on kind of the just sort of the pattern and the structure of what this update process should look like. And it's also us who are being the points of contact with these other projects or with the maintainers of Composer itself. We've talked to the folks over there on several occasions. And then together with a bunch of different folks in the community, we're working on the client side of the automatic updates, right? The thing that actually stages a full Composer update and verifies that it's going to be clean, and then copies that over your code base and gets you fully up to date and abstracts away from that command line necessity. And then that same initiative forms the basis of the project browser initiative, right? Because installing a new module is sort of, it's just a new variation of updating a module. Basically, the underpinnings, the mechanics are very similar. And so it's supporting all of that work at the same time. And that's one of the areas where the Drupal Association is trying to evolve what we do. So, I've said before, we were mostly originally, we hosted all these tools, we provided all of these tools, and we built these things. But it's only the last couple of years where, my team has been directly in an initiative or in several initiatives, really coordinating at this level. And in that way, I don't say we want to again, direct the project, but we do want to be there to sort of put our thumb on the scale a little bit for certain initiatives that we think are particularly important. And so by jumping in and offering our resources as well, we can hopefully accelerate some of those critical ones.
Well, and you also have the megaphone, right? Is that the right word?
Megaphone.
Megaphone. My God, the other day I was
bullhorn or megaphone, yeah.
Anyways, you guys have the megaphone. So when it comes to these initiatives and making the community aware of them, you have the loudest voice because you have Drupal.org. I want to just underscore how important it is to folks like Mark and I that there is inspiration and that there is new talent and new folks contributing to the project, because Drupal's success is our success. We sell Drupal services. And if the overall status of the project is in question or not innovating with the rest of the industry or the marketplace, that's scary to us. So, we had a hot take episode, maybe episode 2, where we were sort of discussing whether or not that support should be, that D7's end of life should happen this year. And it is our opinion after that discussion that yes, there's too much good that we might be foregoing, or that we might be punting down the road farther and falling further behind by maintaining this project longer. I understand that this is a very difficult discussion and a difficult decision. Do you want to talk about how the association and the governance around this decision, how that all comes together and how that manifests?
Yeah, so for people who followed the updates on Drupal 7 end of life and previous extension sort of situations, you've probably read, and if not, you can find it on Drupal.org/security. There was a public security advisory for the last time that the end of life was extended, right? And that security advisory extended Drupal 7's end of life to November 1st of this year, 2023. And there was also a little bit of a revision in what that process was going to look like. So at that same time, that decision was made by bringing together Dries as the founder and project lead, Drupal Association staff, including myself, and Drupal security working group members in particular. And Dries also collaborated with core maintainers, obviously, who work in leadership of the project too. But that small group came together, DA, security group, project lead, to discuss the kind of the pros and cons, but also honestly, a lot of those discussions, I suspect, were very similar to your hot takes episode, about just what are all the considerations that come into play. And some amount of it is the volume of sites that exist on a prior version. And everyone on Drupal 7 is still a member of the Drupal community, right? And we want to support them in continuing a journey with Drupal, right? Now, not all of those sites maybe are right for Drupal's kind of market position. In the 7 era, Drupal you could use for anything from the most basic blogging website to highly complex user portals that had PII and HIPAA compliant health data platforms, all these sorts of things. And we've kind of settled on agreeing that Drupal is not necessarily just for the enterprise, but it's definitely for people who are trying to do something ambitious, as Dries likes to say, who have a need that's more than brochureware, who need permissioning, need this kind of user functionality. And there's probably some 7 sites out there that don't do any of that, and therefore they don't need to come along. But we do want to bring the rest along. And so, this discussion looked at what is the current volunteer interest in supporting Drupal 7, and in particular supporting Drupal 7 contributed modules. What's been the recent volume of security-related reports and things like that? What does it actually take in terms of DA resources and security team resources to do that sort of support? And, the kind of cost-benefit analysis of, what could we do if we weren't doing this, as we alluded to earlier. And so all these factors get considered, and it's not an easy formula where we can just plug in numbers and get out an answer. There's a subjectivity to it. But at the time, it was like, okay, we've plugged those in. We agree that it's going to be extended to 2023, and we agree that it needs to be reevaluated annually, and that folks need at least sort of 6-month notice. So the current official line, which I will not deviate from, is that it'll be no later than July of 2023 when an announcement would be made about whether there would be any additional extension. But no matter what that means, people should be building a plan to move on, even if there was an extension, which I'm not saying there will be another one. But even if there was, you should only, again, consider that runway, not consider that like, okay, you're just going to sit where you are, right? It's a really good opportunity to go work with a partner who has now, by this point, done multiple projects, moving 7 sites into modern versions of Drupal, or to reimagine what you've been doing entirely. I mean, a decade later, your digital strategy might need to be different than what it was before. And you might want to not start from scratch per se, but you may want to rethink kind of what you're doing.
So I want to pull a couple things together. One, of those 400,000 sites, I think you've sort of called out a couple different groups, and Chris and I have talked about them in similar terms, but there are some people in that group that are still on Drupal 7 where if they're building a new site today, Drupal might not be the first or top of the selection, just because the market is so different from when they maybe built a site 10 years ago. But then there are sites that, when they were built on Drupal 7, but if they were built today, Drupal 10, modern Drupal is absolutely the best
right choice. Yeah.
The best choice. But inherently, those sites are often the more complicated sites. They're often the bigger sites. They often have the most custom code. And so there are a lot of folks out there where that path to Drupal 10 is still quite daunting. And if they were, starting today, building a site from scratch, it might be a no-brainer to go to Drupal 10, but they're still left with the question of how do we get there? Yeah. And they have this date looming. I'm curious. I sort of had the opinion in the hot take episode, the only thing worse than extending, the only thing worse than not extending the end of life date would be extending the end of life date. They're both awful options.
They both have consequences that are going to be fairly serious, right?
But I was, sitting here thinking mainly from the perspective of someone who I haven't built a new Drupal 7 site since Drupal 8 has come out. But there's Drupal 7 and the number of sites on Drupal 7 still affect us as an agency, and they still affect the Drupal community. And I was talking to someone recently about it, and for those large sites that are being built today on Drupal 10, whether they're government sites, as you mentioned, whether they're education sites, that number of sites that are on Drupal, that 400,000 Drupal 7 sites plus how many modern Drupal sites, whatever the total is, that number is important when some of these executives are making a decision, whether it's because Drupal is listed on the Gartner quadrant and all of that. So how concerned are you if a big chunk of those 400,000 Drupal 7 sites were to go away?
Can I interrupt real quick too?
Yeah, please, Chris.
This is the second tertiary question or something I was going to interject, but I'm watching the Drupal 7 stats on Drupal.org come down, but they're not coming down that quick. And I'm wondering, there must be new Drupal 7 sites reporting back. So like, it's not that the number is just coming down. I'm certain there are new Drupal 7 sites.
I suspect, I'm more than suspect. I do have some data, although not in a great report form. I'm sure there are new sites coming in as well. And so, there is an element of that. Although it's, you can look, there's third-party resources. So Drupal.org /metrics offers the metrics that we have ourselves, or Drupal.org /project/usage, whichever project you want, including core. And you can get stats on what's out there. And we're still in the total sites being in around the million sites range. But if you use a third-party service like Built With, for example, or things like that, you can see the sort of mesa that shows up, where it's like this growth in Drupal 7 and a sort of a plateau, and it's sort of coming down the other side. And then you look by version for sort of 8, 9, and 10, and you see those are having what looks like the front part of the 7 slope, not at the rate to replace all of that 7 immediately, though, right? So to your point, Mark, like if we treated modern Drupal as if it was an open source project in isolation, like if we pretended that it wasn't coming from a place where Drupal 7 had previously existed, we are seeing an open source project that is seeing actually pretty strong, like near hockey stick kind of growth in its own version, but not at the sheer volume that existed in Drupal 7. And that's an interesting conundrum. And we've been talking about this at a leadership level with our board and with other folks, which is, okay, you look at the overall picture, and if you have a decline of 7 sites, then maybe the overall number of Drupal trends down for a little bit, especially around the time that this end of life happens. But then we take that hit, fine. And then we focus our efforts on growing and fostering this new Drupal that is accelerating in its growth at the moment. And so that's kind of how we think about it. The other thing that we do think about a lot is that I've always been uncomfortable, even since I started, with trying to measure Drupal success in terms of a like absolute value number of sites versus the traffic that those sites serve, perhaps as a better proxy. Because you might have an example where it's like, okay, you have one Drupal site and one WordPress site or some other project site, right? But if that Drupal site is, weather.com, or if it's top 20 most trafficked website, then it's not really an apples to comparison to count that as just one. But that's a little bit hard to do in terms of data, and we do have a little bit of a data struggle at the moment also, because the decoupled sites, the JavaScript front ends, they often don't report that they're built on Drupal underneath. And speaking of initiatives, we do have this notion of doing a telemetry initiative so that we can get better data about the new Drupal sites that are out there. I've wandered a little bit from your point. We are concerned to see an overall decline in Drupal installations, right? And we're kind of expecting to see that as Drupal 7 reaches its end of life. So we're not like thrilled that that's the case, but we also understand that we are focusing on a certain kind of site or a certain kind of site builder, that person who does have ambitions for what they're doing with their site. And we're realizing that, look, we need to treat what was a significant change in the way we build Drupal and give it the credit that we would if it was a new open source project. So,
yeah, I think the overall decline of Drupal usage in terms of absolute numbers, or those statistics that you're talking about, I think at a high level would be concerning. But if you look a little bit closer, you dig a little bit deeper, and you think about modern Drupal, quote unquote, trying to be more of a right fit tool for a certain type of site or a certain team, or it makes a lot of sense that a good portion is going to go away. Whereas Drupal 7 back then, Drupal was trying to be kind of everything to everyone. And it was everything to everyone. It was so easy to pick up, so easy to install modules. You could get so far with, I don't want to say basic knowledge, but an intermediate developer could do something really ambitious. I don't think that's the case with quote unquote modern Drupal or Drupal with Composer. There is quite a bit of extra, more advanced sort of developer things that you need to object-oriented programming, Composer. That just you talking about the project browser and the automatic updates, as somebody who has interacted with Composer directly and who is very technical, I am like, well, I need a degree in package management to do this. This is very tricky. I'm pretty good. I can't imagine for somebody who is still in, procedural PHP and maybe damn good at it, what that would be like. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is ultimately, yes, it's going to go down, but that is something that I think the community needs to accept, because Drupal is becoming a tool for a certain type of site.
Yeah,
and that should be embraced.
And it's funny because the type of site it's for is, again, it's almost not that it's so. I appreciate focus. It's like I love it when we can actually have a more focused goal, and it's so hard to do in open source generally, and Drupal specifically. As any of you know, just managing technical teams, the notion of being able to try and focus on a particular idea, I think, is actually really powerful. So I think it'll be really good for Drupal to focus on these things, again, this sort of enablement of ambitious digital experiences, the way Dries likes to describe it, with this tool set, I think is really strong. And I kind of see what's so interesting is there's been such a strong investment in the fundamental technology that with initiatives like auto updates in Project Browser, but then the following ones, this sort of recipes initiative to try and make it's hopefully going to be significantly more sort of sophisticated in the way we do distributions, but to let you plug in not a single module, but a group of modules to do a set of functionality together, a re-envisioning of what distributions was supposed to be. These sorts of things, I think, are going to make these puzzle pieces easier to put together and unlock some of the potential that right now, like you say, Chris, you've got to have 15 years of background to feel like you really got a handle on it. I want to pull one other point, though, out, which is you were talking about, and if I think about as someone who knows procedural PHP or whatever, and those are an audience I want to think about, but I want to think about as someone who just graduated, or someone who is trying to do freelance work at home, or someone who's trying to start a business, someone who's early 20s, whatever. And maybe what they're learning is they're learning JavaScript. They're learning ML models and little AI things, because that's what's exciting and interesting, right? How do we capture their interest, and what are the problems? We think people who learned in procedural PHP think in procedural PHP when we start addressing new problems, and I don't think a lot of these new developers think that way. And I don't think they think necessarily in object-oriented PHP either, but they do think in dependency management. NPM has a huge hockey stick growth, and that's all done using Composer-like, dependency management and managing these trees and things like that. And that's clearly not been the fundamental barrier for that group. So I don't know. I think we also have to attend to a different sort of audience that we want to capture. In addition to letting go of mature technology and legacy technology, and in addition to focusing on new innovation with the community we have, I think we really do also need to think about what's the on-ramp for the kinds of digital thinking that newer folks are doing into Drupal.
Well, speaking of letting old technology go, we addressed maybe the elephant in the room, that is Drupal.org still being on Drupal 7.
Yeah, we can.
So Mark might have a more pointed way of asking that question.
Good transition, good segue. How does Drupal.org still being on Drupal 7 affect your thinking about Drupal 7 end of life?
In my opinion, it should. So it should have no bearing on when the actual end of life happens. Like, we would never say, "Oh, Drupal.org is not ready, so we're going to change the date." There's no way in the decision-making process. So, that's definitely not part of it. What it does give me is it gives me the perspective of someone who's running a big, complex 7 website and is trying to figure out, just like you said earlier, how do I get from this complex installation to 10? And so on the positive side, we've done some of this a little bit already. So events.drupal.org is now on 10. That was an easier site to do the lift on. API.drupal.org is sort of ready to deploy. portions of www.drupal.org are ready that are there to support the project browser. They're sitting in a staging environment, and at the same time, this is a little behind the scenes, but we're working on new Kubernetes-based, EKS-based sort of modernization of how we host Drupal. And so we're finishing getting that sort of stack together as we do some of these transitions. But from an actual Drupal code base perspective, we're in pretty good shape for the rest of the star.drupal.org subsites and those transitions. So that's coming together. But yeah, I would never hold up an end of life date on that. I don't think
let me ask you then, as the person responsible of a complicated Drupal 7 site, we have talked a lot about like, what is it actually going to be like if you're still on Drupal 7 on November 2nd? Like, you know, it's easy for, I think a lot of the talk is around, well, how do you upgrade and what do you have to do? But we've spent time talking about, well, what does it mean? You're not going to have, you know, trusted security announcements. You're not going to have releases. There might be 0-day exploits. So is that feasible for you as someone responsible for Drupal.org? Like, what position would that leave Drupal.org in, and how would you think about managing that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question, but it's certainly one we've thought about a little bit, which is to say, you know, we and this is already true to a certain extent for any site owner, but we even more so become responsible for our own sort of security practices, right? It's not that we don't. I hate to say it, there's a lot of Drupal 6 sites out there too, right? And they haven't had the support for years and years. And hopefully they're not all Bitcoin miners at this point, but who knows? It's hard to be certain. But yeah, I mean, there's security best practices we have to put in place. There's things we would have to consider in terms of how much could we lock down at kind of a CDN level? And are there some properties or even just sections of sites that we would staticify and things like that? Yeah, you know, we don't want to be stuck in that position. My guess is that there will still be a number of different folks not doing it in the official project capacity, but a number of folks, because they still own some sites that they're still working on, who continue to collaborate and say, hey, you know, we have a patch that we think should be a security update kind of a thing, and still work on some responsible disclosure stuff. That'll evolve a little bit.
For people, though, to sort of track that if they're not involved on Drupal.org. I've made a lot of hay about, like, well, who do you then follow to find out that there is a security disclosure, that there is a patch available, and has that patch been vetted? And some of these are conversations that we should have with some members of the security team as well, and get some of their ideas. I'm sure I know, because I've been in some of these conversations, that it's something that folks are thinking about. But again, we get into that balance between what's the administrative overhead of, hey, we're trying to stop support and we're also trying not to leave people in the lurch. And it'll be tricky, and it'll be a balance, and some of it will be good and some of it won't be so good. It's just going to be a little messy. But yeah, you know, and I would say one of the reasons that Drupal.org tends to be among the later sites to do an upgrade like this is part of it is, you know, everybody has some custom code. That's very common in the Drupal space. And so I'm not pretending we're unique in that, but Drupal.org does have some pretty unique custom code in terms of how many other sites out there are Drupal sites hosting open source communities and have a project module installed, right? So there's some things where it's like we can't rely on the community in the same way to be focusing on these top 100 contributed modules that are what build our sites, because some of our most important pieces of functionality are unique to Drupal.org. So you know, that's one of our biggest things. Oh, Chris, I think you're muted.
Oh, damn it. Sorry. They're critical to those unique pieces of custom code are critical to the success of the project. The things you talked about at the start of the call, which like packaging and, you know, just these pipeline things and tests and all these things that no one who's running a publication site or a government site, D7, D8, whatever version, they're not worried about maintaining that. That's entirely on you. You aren't contributors who are familiar with that code who can help on it. So
exactly. Well, there's a couple, but not very many.
Yeah,
there's
not many.
That's the thing. There are some volunteers in the community who do awesome things and are like, hey, I want to help out with Drupal.org. And actually, we were talking about ports to modern versions. The localized site, again, not deployed yet, but basically ready for deployment, almost entirely done by a volunteer group. And that's, again, not functionality. The localization server side stuff, not functionality that hardly anyone else needs. So there are people who help. I don't want to pretend we're doing it entirely alone, but we are a team of 4 engineering staff, including myself, supporting this whole open source project. And not to get too sort of touchy feely about it, but again, folks like yourselves as Drupal certified partners, the individual members of the association, right? They pay the salaries that make it possible for us to do this. And so, and there's other things we do as well, right? We are, as you know, most of the behind the scenes tooling is GitLab now, and we're moving more of the front half of that, things like issues and so on, and testing more and more into GitLab over time. And that reduces the custom code of the custom, like, why are we doing issue tracking with a custom Drupal thing when that is a solved problem? Why are we doing this kind of stuff?
And so is some of the migration of Drupal.org to D10, is that dependent on completion of like, okay, let's get the GitLab migration done of issues so then we can take out that custom code instead of upgrading it to Drupal 10?
Ideally, yes. Yeah. Okay. I mean, there's some things we won't block on just because we don't want to be stuck, but on certain things. But yeah, we've already started, and we're continuing to delete literally thousands of lines of code that we're moving out of other things. So that's a big help. And it's been fun collaborating with some of the GitLab folks. They recently launched, there was a blog post about it. They launched a trial run of a community forking model, which is basically our, hey, make an issue fork that anyone can work on model. The same thing straight out of Drupal. They just launched that for contributing back to GitLab core. And because they're trialing that out, I'm very hopeful that they'll start integrating more features that support that kind of thing. So we work in that very collaborative Drupal way, using their off-the-shelf tools more. So yeah.
That's very cool. And vindication for the people who in the GitLab, GitHub, when we were vetting all of those tools, vindication for people that were like, this is a great way to contribute where we can all push code to the same.
And make it better for every open source project that uses the same tool set, and presumably for all the competitors who are going to try and keep up. So, yeah.
So we talked, we were talking a bunch about the graph and the numbers, the telemetry. And for a big part of the run of this series, I was under the impression, I kind of rolled my eyes at this graph, like for the similar reasons that I think you, pointed out, which is, who cares how many Drupal sites there are? It would be a much more interesting graph to see the number of pages served or users served for each version of Drupal. But we're kind of tied to this graph in a way, at least for now, because it's the graph we have. So it's the graph that everyone is looking at. And I think I've come to understand like the influence that this graph has, these numbers have on these decisions. I think it is important. It's understandable to me, and I think probably many people listening, why we need to end of life Drupal 7, the resources that it will free up, the attention that it will free up. And we've talked about what people will lose if they're still on Drupal 7. But there is a related project that has a security team that's continuing to focus on, security issues for a Drupal 7-like sites. They have commits, they have, announcements, and that's Backdrop. And, people have sort of, I think Backdrop has been in the conversation when talking to folks still on D7, say like, well, this is an option. Like you could go and, evaluate this. And Backdrop is a descendant of Drupal 7, a fork of Drupal 7. From your perspective, though, as we look at this number, 400,000 sites still on Drupal 7, 8 months out from end of life, is there an opportunity to more formally collaborate with the Backdrop team?
It's a good question. I mean, we talked earlier about division of resources and where we're choosing to invest our time. So like formally and officially through the Drupal Association and through my role, like the Drupal Association is here to foster Drupal, like mainline Drupal, modern Drupal. That's the main thing that we want to do. At the same time, we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face. We don't want to just abandon all these groups of folks. And so, I've been checking out the Backdrop meetings and attending with some folks and talking to their community, because there are going to be people out there who are on 7 who say, yeah, I think I'm just not ready to try and figure out this whole Drupal with Composer thing. My budget's got cut 3 years in a row for during COVID and all this stuff, and I can't do it. And maybe Backdrop will let me be there. Maybe it'll be a bridge. Maybe it'll be a long-term solution. That might work for them. And that's going to happen. And I don't think that from a DA or Drupal community point of view, that stamping our feet and saying, no, we only care about modern Drupal is a reasonable answer. It's open source, and people are going to do open source things. So in terms of what I would like to see is I'd like to see sharing of resources. I'd like to see, just better understanding, co-presence. We've done some co-presence at these virtual events. We'll see. I don't know what might happen at things like DrupalCon or whatever. But Dries has said that Backdrop folks are certainly welcome at events like DrupalCon or Drupal camps. I think that might be an opportunity. I would love to see what is the, I don't want to just be deferring a problem, right? Like a lot of us are thinking of it as like, how do I get 4 more years of Drupal 7? And I'd much rather have site owners be asking the question, how do I get my next 10 years of Drupal? Like, I'd like it to be a looking forward conversation rather than a holding back conversation. And as that relates to Backdrop or modern Drupal, I'd like to know, well, is there a bridge back? What is it going to be like to go, if someone makes that decision to go to Backdrop instead, how are they going to get back to modern Drupal if that becomes the choice for them, and can that be made easier? All these sorts of things. I think there's a lot of opportunity between both. I think there's a lot of opportunity for modern Drupal, like I said, to become more accessible to folks with the current round of initiatives. I hope that keeps going. But yeah, we'll just have to see.
Yeah, I would love to see more discussions around this space, around what we can do for those 400,000 sites. The Backdrop team learned so much about them recently, and it's interesting from the perspective of all this already exists for them. Like, it's not like what if somebody kept up with Drupal 7 quote unquote security updates? Well, Backdrop is doing Backdrop security updates as a fork. So we've been highlighting that as one of the options for folks that are on Drupal 7. And, maybe they're a site that we talked about here, a site where it doesn't make as much sense in modern Drupal, but they want to continue to, the site is still important to their business. Let's say, like, they don't want to.
There's nothing that says that once a site is 10 years old, it's suddenly not worth anything anymore. Right. It could be still functioning very, very well. And I think all of those things are legitimate. My long-term hope is to keep Drupal 10 focused on that ambitious audience, but also make it accessible and empowering to users, so that learning curve is shallow out that learning curve, but still make it for those ambitious folks and make it a path that people can use. But I want all of our existing Drupal 7 users ideally to stay adjacent to the community, certainly to stay in open source. I hope. And I think, this is not a place where we spent time, and I know we're basically out of time, but I think recent events have shown how dark things can get when you don't control your own publishing platform, when you don't control your content. And there's been some, I don't think anybody wants to see all those 7 sites just go to Facebook pages, for example, right? Like that kind of stuff. I think we need to do what open source has always done and collaborate.
So on that note, should people follow you on Mastodon or?
They can, yeah. I'm on Mastodon under Tim Lehnen. The Drupal community is starting to move there. Drupal Association has handles there. We haven't completely swapped everything over yet, but Yeah, we've reserved all the handles for the channels that you already follow: Drupal Infra, Drupal Org, Drupal Assoc, Drupal. Those things exist and are starting to post content. So yeah, hopefully we'll see more stuff over there.
That's great. Is there anywhere, you've given us so much time and we appreciate that. Is there any place that you want to point people to, point their attention to as we wrap up?
It's a great question. If you are, I know there's multiple audiences who might be listening to this. So if you're a Drupal 7 site owner, and you're thinking about either upgrading to Drupal or what to do about your ongoing site, I would say certainly continue to follow along on Drupal.org, Drupal.org/security. We'll have some details, but also talk to your partners, talk to the folks who've been helping you with your current site or your existing site, and they can come up with a more sort of detailed plan that's going to help you out. If you are just an individual interested in the Drupal community, I hope maybe you'll join the Drupal community Slack, or some of the Mastodon community, or just some of those channels where you can be a little bit more closely real-time involved. And finally, whether you are an individual or an organization, the Drupal Association would love your support. So Drupal.org/association does have options for joining as an individual member, for joining as a supporting partner, or come to DrupalCon and just say hello and hang out.
We'll see everyone at DrupalCon in Pittsburgh. I know, Tim, I will see you there. And I will see some folks at MidCamp next week. Mm-hmm. So please come say hi. Chris and I will both be there. Tim,
Neil
will you be there?
From my team will be there at MidCamp.
All right. So we'll see Neil at MidCamp next week and everyone else in Pittsburgh in June. Tim, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Tim.
Thank you for having me.